activism works. So what I'm telling you now is to act, because no one is too small to make a difference. A smart young woman called Greta Thunberg said not long ago. During the last 80 years, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, we have seen the human rights field develop rapidly. From a universal declaration to global dissemination of human rights standards, treaties, regional and national legislation, and protection systems with the aim to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. But history is a pendulum. At the same time as we see rapid evolvement of new methods and ways to work with the protection of human rights, we also see an extremely aggressive fight going on in the world about the core idea of democracy and human rights. So how do we find the energy to both keep track on the fight against autocracy, trying to destroy all the progress that has been made during the last 80 years, and at the same time have the energy to innovate, to find new methods for a stronger and better human rights protection? What structural trends and challenges does the law and the human rights field face? What old patterns do we need to change? And what possible future for human rights do we envision? My name is Hanna Gerdes. I am a Swedish human rights lawyer, writer, and educator. And today I have been given the task to moderate this Social Innovation Foresight on human rights, hosted by Forum for Social Innovation Sweden, Mötesplats Social Innovation, at Malmö University. In the work for human rights, we all choose different tools. Me, personally, for example, I chose law. But with time, I have learned that there is no amount of litigation that can substitute the power of education. And every day I try to learn new methods, new tactics, and new strategies to enhance the protection for human rights. Today, I hope that together with you and with our guests, we will be able to discuss and learn a little more about design thinking and how interdisciplinary joint ventures can change the future for human rights. And during this 1-hour talk, you will be able to ask questions. And just below where you're watching this talk right now, there is a chat. So please, if you have any questions, comments, or thoughts, don't hesitate to write in the chat. And I will be able to pose those questions in the end of this talk for the panel. So today with us we have 3 very interesting guests, and I would like to start off with introducing our keynote speaker today, Santiago Pardo Rodríguez. Santiago is a lawyer working at the Colombian Constitutional Court and also the founder of the first Access to Justice Design Lab in Colombia at the Universidad de Los Andes. The lab is a joint venture between law, design, and engineering to create a new generation of legal and judicial processes. This, and why this kind of interdisciplinary joint ventures are actually needed to develop human rights, we will hear more about now. So now I will hand over to our keynote speaker and the keynote speech.
Hello, my name is Santiago Pardo Rodríguez, and I am a Colombian lawyer who, as Gregor Samsa in Kafka's Metamorphosis, woke one morning from an uneasy dream and found myself transforming my bed into a gigantic insect. But what type of insect? Well, let me start by answering this with a powerful thought from Rebecca Sandford, a professor at Arizona State University. In 2009, the political journal Politico convened experts from around the world to answer a simple yet mind-numbing question: how to fix the law. Let me read a quote from Professor Sanford's answer. A mind-blowing answer. One of the great paradoxes of democracy is that ordinary people elect representatives to write laws that ordinary people often cannot use. These laws are meant to order the most basic facts of our lives: making a living, having shelter, getting healthcare, taking care of dependents. But often people are unable to use these laws because courts and legal processes are needlessly complex, designed for and by lawyers. Many people who are not lawyers could be providing valuable help, but cannot because of lawyers' monopoly on the law. End quote. So, well, paraphrasing Professor Sanford, I am an insect. I am a creature of the Colombian legal system that is trying to upset lawyers' monopoly over the law. And how am I doing it? Well, let me break my answer into 3 parts. First, going rogue, but not alone. In 2018, I co-founded with a designer and an engineer the Access to Justice Design Lab of the Universidad de Los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia. The lab is a joint venture between the School of Law and the School of Engineering and the School of Design, inspired and supported by Professors Margaret Hagen, Stanford Legal Design Lab. Our methodology is based on 4 core elements. Real problem approach. We addressed real and concrete issues regarding access to justice. We work directly with institutions and stakeholders to identify a real problem and a real need. Human-centered design approach. We seek to implement a solution based on a design thinking methodology that puts people experiences in the center, citizens in the center. By doing so, we look for bottom-up solutions that could be easily replicated as we consider the cultural and economical restrictions of our interventions. A metric evaluation approach. Data is the king. Data is a key component for us. We dedicate a lot of time ideating, experimenting, validating, and iterating, so for us, metrics are a key element of our work. We want to show real-world impact by evaluating the success or not of our interventions. We learn through failure, and metrics are pivotal to fine-tune our improvements. Last, interdisciplinary approach. We promote a real conversation between lawyers, engineers, designers, and many other disciplines to understand access to justice. The second part of my answer. We laser focused on changing the meaning and scope of one of the most important human rights, the right to access to justice. For this, let me tell you a short story about constitutional history. I promise you are not going to fall asleep. In 1991, a new political constitution was enacted in Colombia, a true democratic revolution in our country. The new constitution provided for the creation of the tutela as a mechanism to protect the fundamental rights of ordinary citizens. Everyone in my country has a constitutional right to file a tutela before any court in the country if they feel their fundamental rights are violated or at risk of being harmed. For instance, a tutela may be submitted if somebody is not getting adequate medical care, his children or her children are not going to school, or other of any of the social, economic, political rights guaranteed and enacted in our Constitution. Most importantly, there are no formalities required for the submission of the tutela. You don't need a lawyer. You don't need any legal background. You can file it written or orally. The tutela by excellence, it's informal. However, although it is stated clearly in the Constitution that the tutela can be submitted to any judge orally, it is very difficult to do that in the reality. Because, well, basically, judges, as all the lawyers in my country, are used to paper. In a world where law is a monopoly of lawyers, paper is the king, and what is not put in pen and paper does not exist. So, Lawyers alone cannot think of new ways to promote the use of oral tutelas in Colombia, right? We are creatures of habit, and we don't understand that although tutelas can be placed or filed in an oral way, it is impossible for us to think in how to transform that into reality. And here comes the third part of my answer. We reimagine legal tools. With a mind-blowing group of students coming from engineer, design, law backgrounds, our work is based on a very simple premise. Law is a social artifact and we must renovate it. And how we do that? Well, through ideation, validation, prototyping, and iteration. For example, how about if we create a tool where any person can narrate its tutela and the system transcribes everything into an easy-to-read format? How about if all judges have this tool in their chambers? How about if we introduce a mandatory design service class for all the judges and judicial servants of the country, public servants of the country? These are plausible answers, real answers that are within our reach, and that in my opinion would dramatically transform the way we understand access to justice. Finally, what does my experience say about barristers in Colombia? Well, that we are paradoxical. We are creatures of habits and there is a strong cultural resistance to change. But also, I am convinced that many of us are eager to find new ways of understanding the law, and I believe we have a sincere desire to expand, promote, and consolidate the rule of law in our country with a human-centered design approach to access to justice. Justice in the end are not the codes, are not the constitutions, are not the decisions, are not the judges or the barristers. No, justice in the end is a human need for peace. That is our goal, and that is where the future of law lays ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that keynote, Santiago. And I'm very happy that I'm having you here with me live today as well. Hey, there you are. Nice to see you. Hi. Is it morning now in Colombia?
Yes, good morning from Colombia. How are you?
What time is it?
9:24 a.m.
Ah,
so it's not that in
9:24.
the morning, not
Yeah,
that
it's,
early in the morning.
it's
But
afternoon
very
here in
happy to
Sweden.
be here with you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and thank you for Malmö University for the invitation.
I have to start off by asking you at once, because it's so interesting what you're telling us about the tutela system. So I have to ask you, how often is it used today? I mean, has it made a difference, the system?
Well, it's very common. Actually, we have a saying in Colombia, we love football and we love our tutelas. That's basically what we like in Colombia. Actually, let me give you some data around the tutela so you can make an idea of how massive the tutela the people uses the tutela in our country. Every day, 3,500 tutelas are filed in Colombia. In a year previous of COVID, 2019, 2018, around 600,000 to 700,000 tutelas were filed in 1 year in Colombia, especially regarding right to health and right to education. Around 2 of every 5 tutelas are related to health issues. So it's a massive use, and that's also a very, that tutela has been really transformative in my country because people, for the first time, have basically used a legal tool to transform their reality in a very massive and very universal way. But that, of course, have created a lot of logistical challenges. We have a huge backlog in the judicial system regarding the tutelas, because every judge in the country has to file the tutela and has to solve a tutela. There is a lot of backlog in the usual or ordinary cases. So, for example, there is a lot of problems in Colombia regarding backlogs on criminal judges. So, because they have to prioritize the solving tutelas, but in the meantime, they have a lot of cases regarding the liberty of people that are backlogged because they have to take care first of the tutelas. So it has been really transformative, but it also has been really challenging regarding the design of our judicial system. And just in one final thought about the transformation of the tutela, thanks to the tutela also, because at the end, the Constitutional Court is the last resort court in constitutional matters. And from all over that pool or sea of tutelas, of 6,000 tutelas, each year the Constitutional Court picks some tutelas, around 200, 300 tutelas per year. And thanks to the tutela and the Constitutional Court, for example, we have the recognition of same-sex marriage. We have the recognition of legal adoption for same-sex couples. We have, for example, protected the right to LGBTQ students that are basically bullied at school because of their sexual orientation. So tutela has been really, really transformative in a very conservative country like Colombia, and in a very unequal country like Colombia.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question, because you said that as lawyers, we are creatures of habit, right? So I wanted to ask you, what has the attitude been amongst lawyers when it comes to the tutela system? I mean, I guess I can just take up, like here, I have an iPad, so I could take up this iPad and I could like file an oral claim and send it in, and it will be considered valid in a court of law? Yeah?
Yes, exactly. That's the idea, and that's the prototype that we have that we have been working for the last couple of years at the lab. And it has been, well, I have to be very blunt with you. It has been very, we have received different critiques, or a very variety of reactions. There are a couple of judges that are really eager to understand how they can file tutelas orally, and actually how they can expand the oral system in the tutelas. Actually, I don't think about oral resolutions. So judges don't have to write their decision, but they can orally solve a problem. And we have a couple of judges, especially very, very interesting judges from not Bogota, not the main cities, but from small cities that are really interested in finding out how to introduce these oral tutelas. But in the other side, like in the other side of the spectrum, we have all, especially very traditional judges that come from very formal legal backgrounds, that they say, no, if I file a tutela orally, I am going to be basically sent to. Actually, one judge told us that he thought that if he filed a tutela orally, he was going to be sent to jail because he was committing perjury, because he didn't understand that the Colombian system allowed an oral way to solve the tutelas. And that's sometimes the extreme. We saw in the reactions, but I have to say that I am like a half full glass kind of guy. So I think that the reactions have been, although we have a lot of resistance, I have to say that we have found really powerful allies within the judicial system that are trying to change things.
I have to ask you just one last question before we go on to the next speaker, but you will be coming back again, Santiago, in the end for the panel, so we'll have a chance to ask more questions. And also, if anyone who's following us now in the on this broadcast, please, you can also write in the chat, and I will try to catch as many of those questions as I can. But I have to ask you something, because I mean, the tutela, it's a part of actually getting access to justice. But once you get that, one thing that's also is interesting when we talk about innovation is, of course, redress and redemption. This is also sometimes very monopolized, like you said, within the legal system in quite a limited way. In Sweden, for example, there is only almost a possibility to get economical compensation, except for, of course, jail sentences, when there are different kind of human rights violations. And I know that in the inter-American system, that you know much more about, of course, there's other forms of redemptions. You can get an official apology. A court can sentence that a school or a street should be named to commemorate the violation. Different kinds of redress that are often very important for people who are marginalized, and sometimes much more important than getting actually economical redress. So could you tell me a little bit about that? What's the approach in the legal system to other kinds of redress and innovation when it comes to that?
Well, that's a great question, Hannah, and I think Charity could tell you more about that. But at least in the tutela level, because the tutela is very informal by nature, actually by constitutional mandate, the tutela is informal. Judges that solve tutelas, that are all the judges in the country, have find very creative ways of redemption and protection of rights. So, of course, we have like a first level of readdressing or protection of the rights. So it's give an exact mandate. So if I am a person that need a health service and I file a tutela, the first level would be, okay, that person, the hospital has to give that person this exact treatment in this exact time of time. That would be like the first level of the traditional way of solving the tutelas. But what happens when this hospital consistently has problems solving or getting access or giving care to people? What happens if it's not one tutela, it's not two tutelas, it's not three tutelas, it's 1,000 tutelas, 3,000 tutelas, 4,000 tutelas regarding the same problem? And then that's where tutela has been also really transformative in the country, because judges start to find that tutelas also show structural problems regarding the protection of human rights in our country. And how you solve those structural problems? Just giving a short mandate to give access or to give that service? No. Then judges in tutela, for example, have created from structural decisions, like to say, okay, this hospital has to be intervened by the state, or okay, I am going to create a special chamber within the Constitutional Court to address this specific problem during a lapse of time. And I'm going to give structural orders, like for example, hiring more people, changing the design of the hospital, telling the Ministry of Health, okay, you have to you have to enact a public policy around this problem, and you have to do it in 6 months, for example. And I'm going to follow up of each of the orders you are giving. And also, for example, there are other interesting cases regarding symbolic reparations. So, for example, there is some cases regarding health that actually the court has ordered the Ministry of Health or the CEO of the hospital to give public apologies to the people that are not receiving that care, or actually putting a plaque on the hospitals, actually recognizing the fault and asking for forgiveness. So tutela, and I'm sure Charity is going to say more about this because she's the expert, and I'm wrapping up. Tutela, because of its informal way, has allowed also very creative forms of readdressing this problem, but that's still a very present issue in our country.
Yeah, thank you so much, Santiago. This is really interesting. I mean, like you say, it's really rechanging law in a very exciting way, especially if you work in quite a fixed legal system like the Swedish one is. So thank you. It was very interesting. And we're going to come back to you in a little while. Now I would very much like to introduce our next guest, Charity Ryerson. Charity is the executive director and founder of the Corporate Accountability Lab. Charity has an extensive experience in labor and human rights monitoring, anti-union violence investigations, and support for labor organizing in Central and South America. And in 2021, Charity received the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable Gwyn Skinner Human Rights Award. So I'm so happy that you're with us today, Charity. Welcome. I would like to start off by asking you a very broad question, and that is, what is the Corporate Accountability Lab? I mean, what do you do at CAL? So I hand over to you and you can tell us a little bit about your work.
Great, thanks, Hannah. Thanks for having me on. Corporate Accountability Lab is an international human rights organization. We focus on corporate human rights abuse, so not state human rights abuse. So often when we think about abuses that people suffer that we put into the category of human rights, we think of it as state-based harm. In our case, we're working only on, or almost exclusively on, cases where usually multinationals, but sometimes national companies are involved in human rights or environmental abuse, mostly in global supply chains. So if you think about big companies, big brands that you've heard of, I think we all have an awareness that many of the clothes that we wear and the food that we eat and the goods that we consumed are produced in ways that are not maybe consistent with our ethics, but we consider this just kind of how the global economy works. So part of what our organization does is we both try to get remedy for victims. Let's say there's a serious oil spill, or there's an anti-union violence case, or indigenous rights are violated in an international development project. We try to get remedy for those harmed victims, but then we also try to look at the bigger structures and figure out what's happening in the global economy that's incentivizing these kinds of abuses, and what can we do to intervene and change the way that that operates. We do this work in forced labor. We focus on transitional justice. We look at global supply chain contracting. And as a methodology, we use design thinking, although in a modified form, to be able to apply that kind of cycle and structure and that structured innovation process to international human rights objectives.
Thank you so much. I think I was working once on a study together with a Swedish organization that also works on corporate accountability, Swedwatch, and they did a study on the garment industry. When they did the study, they realized that first of all, they were focusing on the workplace, right, and the different kind of impeachments on workplace rights. But then when they started actually speaking to all the people working in the workplace, they realized that the real human rights violations and the real problems were actually not only in the workplace, but were actually a lot of people being afraid because they had to travel very far, unsafe roads, they had to leave their children for a long while. So very quickly they understood that the problems, actually, the human rights violations that the people were facing were different than they thought from the beginning, because they worked from a right-based approach, which means, of course, letting the marginalized people that you work with actually be the people who formulate the problem. And design thinking, when I've been listening to this, it's different terms, it's from Silicon Valley, but I've understood that it's sort of similar and still not. Could you tell me a little bit about that? Because you and I spoke about that. So what is the difference between a right-based approach and design thinking?
This is such a great example. I think that when we think about design thinking, a lot of people are really alienated by the terms. When you look at the Silicon Valley version or even the Stanford D School version, whether it's regular design thinking or legal design, we're using a lot of technical terminology that can alienate, just as much as Santiago was referring to earlier about lawyers having this kind of monopoly on the law. There's a way that designers have a monopoly on design, in part because of this language that we use. At the same time, it does get, some of this language can be really useful. If you zoom out a little bit from a human rights perspective or a social movement perspective, you can see that a lot of the design thinking principles, including what we could, the repackaged rights-based approach, which becomes user-centered design. I think that when you zoom out, you can see that there's a lot of these concepts that have been developed in union organizing and in indigenous communities and in social movements across the globe that have now been absorbed and repackaged and sold back to us as design thinking. That said, the way that it's been sold back to us is still pretty useful, so long as we acknowledge that this is coming from a long tradition of people using these same concepts. So using a rights-based approach, say with the Bangladeshi garment worker, I think this is a perfect example. In design thinking, you would also go and you would sit with the worker and you would try to hear everything about the worker's life. How do you get to work? What do you eat for breakfast? Where do your kids go to school? And build all the way up through, what are your workplace conditions like? What happens at the end of the day when you go home? You know, how do you interact with your managers? How much power do you have in determining what your wage is? All of these questions create this full picture, this rights-based approach that is this early stage of defining the problem in a design cycle. So we just embed all of these different pieces that have been developed in other fields and use that to create these more innovative human rights outcomes. But it's definitely not a denial of the pre-existence of a lot of these concepts, and really a practice of these concepts in a fuller and more holistic way than what we might be seeing in Silicon Valley.
So I have to ask you then, can you explain, like, what is a design cycle? Because, I mean, if you're not from this world, that is, I mean, it's a totally new term. So can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there's a traditional design cycle and there's our design cycle. I'm going to talk about ours, which is a little bit different, but similar. So in traditional design, you have a set of, you have certain steps that are very well defined. You might develop user personas while you're defining what your problem is to make sure that everyone in the room is on the same page. You're going to go through a brainstorming process that you call ideation that might have its own specific activities within it. Eventually you'll prototype. And the prototyping phase, I think, is one piece of design thinking that's not well replicated in a lot of other types of practice out in the world, in the sense that you sit down and you just think through it at every single step. Is this idea going to work in the real world? I'm going to draw pictures. I might have clay. I might build it out. I might do a role play, to really think through all the steps before you take it out into the world and start testing it and see if it really works. And by forcing yourself to stop and go through each of those steps, it really helps you develop something that's going to go out into the real world that I think has a lot more potential to succeed. For us, a big part of design thinking are the design mindsets. So Santiago mentioned some of these, but I think that as lawyers, we're so afraid to fail. We're so risk averse. Whereas design thinking is a very high risk sort of activity where you just try crazy things. You try things that maybe seem very unlikely to work, but if you are always so afraid to fail that you can't try the long shot ideas, the long shot ideas that could win will never win because they'll never be tried. So we have taken a lot of those concepts, which we keep in our cycle. But then at the beginning, we do a systems thinking approach, where instead of coming in with a beginner's mindset, which is kind of the design thinking concept, we come in having done a huge amount of research into the industry that we're looking at, the relevant companies. If we're thinking about a lawsuit, who would be a defendant company? If we're looking at an impacted community, maybe we're not just looking at the experience of that community, but what about other neighboring communities that were also maybe impacted by the oil spill? Or if we're looking at the Bangladeshi garment sector, what about other sectors in electronics manufacturing that might have similar dynamics, but they might play out slightly differently? So in that sense, we zoom out and do this much bigger systems thinking approach at the beginning. And then we'll go through a design cycle that sometimes includes a sprint of a few days, and sometimes it stretches out over the course of years, and it just depends on the nature of the project. But in the end, what we're trying to do is get something out into the real world that we're going to test in a very limited way. So we don't come up with some wild idea, like I'm going to put this clause in a supply chain contract that's going to give workers legally enforceable rights, and now I'm going to try to roll this out in all the supply chains I can get it into. Instead, with that example, what we've done is we found very narrow pilots where we try these new supply chain contracts that give workers legally enforceable rights. And in one specific case, and then maybe we'll do a second pilot. And each time we iterate and we change it and we develop it so that by the time it gets to a scale up phase, it'll already be pretty well vetted and tested. And we'll have hopefully most of the issues ironed out.
And so one final question before we move on to our next guest, but you will be coming back also, Charity, for the panel. But how do you include target groups or people affected by human rights violations in this process? I mean, how do you make sure to work with a right-based approach all the time when doing this?
Yeah, so usually we try to have impacted community members in the room when possible. So an example of this is we recently facilitated a year-long virtual social lab where we had lawyers and activists and community-based advocates from 30 different post-conflict settings all come together and co-create this year-long virtual process during COVID. So this was a COVID adaptation. It was supposed to be a network. But instead, we had, folks from the DRC and South Africa and Liberia and Colombia and Argentina and Chile and Guatemala all come together on a monthly basis and go through a design cycle all the way through. We defined the problem together, and it was trilingual, and it had to be very trauma informed because almost everybody in the room had been impacted directly by war. And so we went through this process over the course of a year, and out of that developed 11 different prototypes, and each of those prototypes has a prototyping team, and those teams are, they're usually 3 or 4 people from 3 or 4 different countries. Sometimes they speak 2 or 3 different languages within the team. So it's a heavy lift to do all of the interpretation and make it work. But when you think about a group of victims and lawyers thinking about, going back to your earlier question, Hanna, to Santiago, about victim-centered remedies, how can they design what outcome they seek rather than depending on the legal system to define to them what outcome they deserve or is accessible to them? And so having groups from so many different places who have similar experiences but in different contexts going through this comparative analysis and development of prototypes together is extraordinarily powerful, and much more so than if a group of people who had not had those experiences sat together in a room and tried to figure this out.
Thank you so much, Herve. You will be coming back soon, and I know there was a lot of light behind you when you were speaking, because you are joining us from Chicago, and just as Santiago, it's morning over there, and as you can see here behind me, it's already getting dark since we are in Sweden. I would like to welcome our next guest, and it's Herve Morin, who is the global lead with the UNICEF Office of Innovation. And UNICEF works in over 190 countries and territories to protect the rights of every child. But I would like to hear more from you, Herve, now about UPSHIFT. What does UPSHIFT do, and how is it related to the work of UNICEF? Can you tell us a little bit more?
So first of all, I was going to say thank you very much for inviting me, having a chance to explain a little bit what UPSHIFT is. So, as I was saying, UPSHIFT is one of the programs of the Office of Innovation, which is based in Stockholm. And the best way to think about UPSHIFT is that it's a learning experiences that starts with a sense of agency of our participants, which are adolescents and young people aged from 10 to 24 years old. And what we do is that we ask them to come with us with problems that they deeply care about, something that affects them personally or that affects their loved ones. And they come to the program where mentors will help them put into practice a human-centered design curriculum and understand the tools and apply them to that particular problem. And as a result, design solutions, what could be a product or a service, to address those solutions. So in essence, the young people that participate get to learn 21st century skills, and they also get to develop solutions that are able to benefit the broader sense of the community. So it in of itself, I mean, the other presenters have explained it better than me, what the human-centered design is, and that it's not something that is specific to Silicon Valley. It's applied in different places, and it's not specific to UNICEF or UPSHIFT as well. But what makes the approach specific for us is that UNICEF, we work on an equity-based approach. So we work with children that are difficult to reach. We work with a marginal group. So UPSHIFT could be applied, for instance, with children with visual impairment in Vietnam, or with speech impairments in Ukraine. We work with children that would be in institutions, for instance, or those that are in conflict with the law, migrant children, street children, or, for instance, young women that are escaping from the adult entertainment industry, for example, just to give a couple of very specific groups. And for the moment, it's an approach that's under implementation in 47 different countries, 25 of which have launched since the onset of COVID. That means that we have a new country launching every 2 months or so, and we should be, by the end of this year, reaching over 3 million young people that would have completed a full 20 to 25-hour learning cycle in developing a project as a result of UPSHIFT.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much, Herve. Can I ask you something? Well, I have a couple of questions. First of all, which age are the children and young people joining the different UPSHIFT programs? And could you tell us a little bit more? I mean, you gave already some examples, but could you give us some more examples of challenges and that the participants address actually when working with you? So, because I know you work in so many different places, so just to give us a better understanding of some of the challenges.
So globally, UPSHIFT would address adolescents and young people that are aged from 10 to 24, but every country implements it a bit differently. So it's quite rare that we have a country that would address the whole age group, because that would have to be different types of programs. So generally, a country would be working with a smaller subset of that age group and specialized in that group. So and they would apply it sometimes differently. For instance, we see that in the younger adolescents, 10 to 14, we're seeing that governments are increasingly interested in integrating the UPSHIFT approach into the education system, because it's from a neurobiological development standpoint, it's a huge window of opportunity of shaping how we perceive the role and how we perceive the world and our role in it. And there is a strong interest in changing the mindsets of young people, that they should be able to look at problems in the community and go ahead and solve them, and promote micro-entrepreneurship and people becoming, in a sense, the architects of their own life and finding solutions to address things that they care about. In terms of the problem that we're seeing, we're really seeing an increased number of young people that come to us with environmental issues. And this is something that there really is a sharp increase in terms of in terms of wanting to address areas, and this could be from like product recycling opportunities to developing sustainable infrastructure, bringing sustainability on existing infrastructure, or working on very specific issues of air pollution or water pollution. So those are the broad themes that we're seeing globally. But what we can see is that in certain communities there are very specific concerns that come out. For instance, last year we have focused on we've implemented UpShift in I think 8,000 schools in Telangana state in India, and a lot of it concentrated in the rural areas. And what we really saw is that we had groups of children, 13, 14 years old, that were really focusing on, they come from daily labor communities that have to work in agriculture. It's very poor communities, and they understand that they have to work and contribute to the economic outcome of the family, but they want to do it differently. And for instance, one solution that came up is that the 13 and 14-year-old group decided to tackle one issue of back pain that develops because some of the generally young women have to start working on some tasks that involve a lot of bending when they're as young as 10, 12 years old. So by the time that they get 30 or 40 years old, they have back problems. And they simply decided to design a tool that allows them to work standing up. And in of itself, it is not a unique solution because those solutions exist, but they find a way, they develop the technology to build this with materials that they could recycle for as little as $1.2. And that's like 15 to 20 times cheaper than what you can find in the as an existing commercial product. And that's like a good example of something that's more thematic to the to one particular area. And in UNICEF, we're really trying to leverage that and working on getting some community members to focus on specific issues that relate to a particular subject, to a particular region.
So that was a very concrete example. Thank you. But I have to ask you then, so who funds these ideas becoming reality? Because, I mean, in so many countries, so many ideas coming from so many young people. So I guess where does the funding come from to make this prototypes or making all these ideas become reality?
Thank you. That's an excellent question because it really links to the sustainability. So what you have is that generally we work with the governments in finding donors to start the project. And once the project is started, we look to integrate it into existing systems. So for instance, if you can integrate it through, like, I don't know, like it could be youth clubs or it could be like the education system, you have a lot of the costs that are absorbed through existing the delivery systems. And the cost of implementing the project are not very high. It can range from as little as $50 to $60 all the way to a couple of $1,000. And generally what we try to encourage is that there be local partnerships with local companies that sponsor specific call for proposal, for instance, or specific entrepreneurship challenges. And in some countries, what we're seeing now is that the government is starting to put money on the table to build the incubation system for developing the idea of young people. For instance, in India, one state now for 2023, they've committed $750,000 to look at some of the biggest and the brightest idea of young people and try to develop them into sustainable businesses or products.
Thank you so much, Herve. I think I would like to ask you now to stay because I would like to invite back Santiago and Charity also, because we have some questions coming in also from the audience, and also please, if you have any more questions, don't hesitate to use the chat. And I have some questions for all of you because, I mean, thank you so much for giving such a good picture of what you do and what you work with, and I would like to now also focus a little bit on the future, and I would like to ask all of you, because you all work in different ways with how social innovation can impact human rights and design thinking. So I would if you would answer that with like just one or two sentences, how does design thinking actually enrich the work for human rights? I mean, for all of us not working today with different kind of design thinking, why would we do this? How does it enrich the work for human rights? Do you want to start, Charity?
Yeah, sure. You know, I think if we look at human rights problems from only the perspective of the victim or those most impacted. We see it in this sort of bubble, and that's a very important bubble to see. If we zoom out, we see that there are these massive, complex transnational systems that are creating incentives that drive these abuses. And so design thinking is going to give us a little bit of an ability to break down something that is so complex. It involves multiple jurisdictions and many legal systems and different economic forces that all conspire together to create these problems. It helps us break that down a little bit, take it into its component parts, and think about how we can view this as a system with incentives and drivers that need to be addressed in order to eventually get down to the human experience of that individual victim or impacted community member. And that's a really important tool to have.
Thank you. And what do you think, Santiago?
Well, I totally agree with Charity. I would just simply add one thing, and it's that, especially coming from Colombia, unfortunately, legal systems many times, and lawyers and judges, consciously or unconsciously, re-victimize victims of human rights. Like the treatment you give to a human rights victim in the legal system, it just re-victimizes him or her. For example, I'm thinking on just one example, victims of sexual violence, and how the judicial system re-victimize these victims. And I think that legal design is a very useful tool to reimagine the way how we treat people in the legal system, and how we can transform the way people interact, or victims interact, within the legal system. And maybe we can think in new ways on how to avoid re-victimization. Mm-hmm. That it's, unfortunately, it's a very huge problem in our legal systems.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts, Herve?
My thoughts is that Charity did a fantastic job at showcasing this, I think, from the institutional standpoint. So there's nothing to add there. What I would just add on the other side is that one, and this might be more specific to UPSHIFT on the project, but one of the things that's very important for us is instilling some of the core principles and tools of human-centered design with young people, because this is something that really equips them also to work for their own rights. Because some of the core elements, I think, that we talked about in human-centered design is that you talk about, a stakeholder mapping. You look at, like using a problem tree to figure out what are the root causes. And this is really something that helps young people not only as a tool in their daily life about being successful, but it allows them also to engage differently. And when we ask them to come up with their own solutions to their own problems, and we do this in cooperation with government, it really is something that's an eye-opener for a lot of government counterparts. And this is, like kind of how the human right element is baked into the approach, in the sense that it is about, it's for the people by the people, and in this case it's children. And so that's a very important element for us, is building the platform where the children can speak to the authorities and change a bit the balance of power, if you want.
There are questions coming in also from people listening to this talk, and so I'm going to pose one of them because it's very closely linked to what you said, Santiago, about re-victimization of rights holders. And the question is, you're mainly working with marginalized groups. I mean, all the three of you. How do you communicate about this without reinforcing the marginalization, prejudice, and socially constructed norms? How do you do that? Who wants to start?
I can start saying that that's a very good question, and I don't have a concrete answer. Actually, because that's one of the problems we constantly addressed in our challenges. And I think one of the huge obstacles we faced is how we don't reinforce those stereotypes, those marginalization ideas. And it's a very good question, and I don't know the answer, but I would just say this. I think especially legal, human-centered design, the methodology of human-centered design is very powerful to avoid that, especially in the ideation and validation stages, because in those stages, people are actually people are the ones who are running the show. People are telling us what does it work, what doesn't work, how to change it, why what our first idea or our first prototype doesn't work, and why it doesn't work. And I think I would say that it's a huge obstacle. Sometimes we have failed on that. I have to be very, very honest with that. But I think that ideation, especially the ideation and validation stages of legal design and human-centered design approaches, are very, very useful and very powerful to avoid or to overcome that problem.
What do you think, Charity and Herve? Do you want to add something?
I can jump in for a minute. This is such a good question. And I think for us in practice, the answer has been nothing is ever going to go at the speed at which we initially think it's going to go, because every question that we ask has to be redesigned by the communities that we're working with. And so because of this constant flow of being able to start and then go back to the beginning and start over, and then start and start over, that gives a ton of opportunities for this kind of interaction. And even in my own language, I hear myself doing this where I talk about victim-centered remedies and impacted community-centered remedies. We had this recently where we had a group from 7-8 different countries talking about this issue of victim-centered remedies, and they stopped the whole process and spent a total of maybe 12 hours over 3 months deciding to rename their group because they didn't like the terminology victim-centered remedies. But there was a lot of discord within the group because in some geographies, they embrace the term victim, and in other geographies, they want to talk about impacted communities or affected communities, and that language is really important. And so allowing groups to come together, even where they have diverse opinions amongst themselves, because affected communities are far from homogenous, right? They're extraordinarily diverse as every individual within them. And so allowing that to be the reality and not to look for a single homogenous viewpoint that comes from the community, but in fact to engage them in the process enough that they're constantly challenging your own questions, the framing of questions, the framing of terms and assumptions. Then throughout the course of the process, you have an outcome that is much more designed by that influence just from the very beginning.
Do you want to add something, Herve?
Yeah, maybe from our perspective, again, it's a bit different because I think what Santiago and Chastity were talking about is more from a system standpoint. So from my approach, we spend more time trying to bring the young people to the system, if you want, in a bit of a different way. So in the sense that we celebrate the achievements of the marginalized group. So in the sense when you like one example, actually the second UPSHIFT I did as a program officer, I mean years back. We working with a group that had visual impairments, and there was this absolutely phenomenal young man that came out about a solution about sensitization and advocacy. And he ended up after that addressing the city council. Then he ended up addressing the national parliament, Ukrainian, and then he went to New York to address the General Assembly and the executive board of UNICEF, because he had a very strong message. So it was about showing a human interest story where we could show that these marginalized groups have something to say, and they have the capacities to find solution to their own problems, and that they should be invited around the table. So it's a bit of the same problematic, but it's different tools, I think, to bridge the gaps here.
So I have 2 more questions for you before we will be rounding up, because as you see, it's getting night here in Sweden, totally. I would like to ask you, what old patterns do you think needs to be changed in the human rights field to have a bigger impact? Like what old patterns that we are stuck in would you see that needs to be changed? Just a couple of sentences perhaps about that. Do you want to start, Herve?
Yeah, well, I think that's been a bit the theme across all of the presentations here. Right? It is basically ensuring that we design with and for people.
Yeah, very concrete, with and for people. Yeah, Charity?
Yeah, I would just add, I think that we need to be more trauma informed, not just in working with the communities that we serve, but also recognizing the level of vicarious trauma within the human rights field overall. And so as we think about being trauma informed, it's not just when I'm in the Congo working with this group of people who are impacted by corporate abuse, but it's also with the attorneys that work in my office with me and are on my team, because they have been exposed to so much vicarious trauma over the years, that how are we building trust and changing the way that we operate with everyone instead of creating these lines between those who are impacted and those who are not. I think that's an evolution that will change our processes, the way that we work together, the amount of trust that we build with our teams, and it will also level the playing field a little bit between ourselves and these communities.
You want to add something, Santiago?
Yes, and I think here I would like to highlight the power of charities and Herve's work, because I think we should change also that it's not only a thing that happens in human rights, but I see it very constantly in human rights, and it's this legal fetishism we have with law, that we change everything with a new code or with a new article or with a new enshrined codification of human rights, and that's it. And that's why the work, for example, Charity and Herves are doing. It's really powerful because they are trying to basically transform what we put in paper to the reality. And we have to walk away from this legal fetishism that basically law changes everything, and that's not true.
So my last question, a little bit more, also turn to the future. What do you see around the corner? What is the future of effective human rights work in your vision, and what is most important for us to get there? What would you say? Charity, do you want to start?
I can jump in first, sure. I think the most important thing is dramatic shifts in power. Right now, there's a small group of people in this world that holds way too much power. And I want to see significantly more power transferred to the West African cocoa farmer and the Bangladeshi garment worker and the child in Iran. I think that we're so used to these extraordinary power imbalances in every sphere in which we work that human rights work sometimes can look like charity. No, it's a joke on my name, but I think that this is something that we don't want human rights work to look like charity. That's not what it is. Human rights work is about rights, and upholding rights is something that someone at some point is going to have to lose power if the impacted communities are ever going to have enough space to make a real difference.
Thank you. What do you think, Santiago?
I totally agree with Charity, and I would say that one concrete manifestation of that shift in power also has to come in the policy stakeholders that are controlling the way we design and we build up this human rights system. So I see in the future more designers, more engineers, more anthropologists, more sociologists being involved in the design of these legal frameworks and legal institutions and in these social artifacts to protect human rights. So I would like to see less lawyers in this type of power instances, of policy decision-making instances.
So the future of human rights is less of us and more of everybody else.
Yes.
I hear you. Okay. And Herve, what do you think?
Well, from a UNICEF standpoint, for us, what's really important is basically looking at the needs of all of the affected groups, because I think that there still is a lot of groups that are, Charity pointed to some of those, but there are a lot of groups that are affected in different manners, and it is a trickle-down effect. So I think that a lot of advocacy work there, and definitely a change in the power structure, are something that's needed moving forward.
So I would like to say thank you so much. Thank you, Herve. Thank you, Santiago. Thank you, Charity, for joining us from all over the world, actually, today for this Social Innovation Foresight on human rights. Very happy to have you with us today. And I say good day for you for today, and hope to see you sometime in the future. And for the rest of you joining us here today, I would like to say please keep posted for more Social Innovation Foresights talks on different topics, and you can follow us in social media, and you will learn more about different social innovation insights that will come, because there will be more shortly. And I would like to end up with a quote. It means a great deal to those who are oppressed to know that they are not alone. Never let anyone tell you that what you're doing is insignificant. That is the words of Desmond Tutu. Thank you so much for today, and hope to see you again.